Why was one man's firewood still dry and neatly stacked, while every other homestead on the ridge was burning wet wood, or slowly freezing without any wood at all? It was the winter of 1883 on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, in what would soon become the state of Montana. The cold that year did not arrive the way cold usually does, gradually, politely, giving men and animals time to prepare. It arrived like a judgment. By mid-November, temperatures had dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius, before the first real snowfall had even settled. The wind came next, steady and low, cutting through log walls as though the timber were paper. Cattle froze standing in their enclosures. Water buckets became solid blocks overnight, and firewood, green, poorly covered, improperly split, turned damp and stubborn, refusing to burn cleanly, choking cabins with smoke instead of warming them with flame. Every homesteader along Copper Creek Road faced the same problem. Every homesteader, that is, except one. His cabin sat at the end of the road, slightly lower than the others, tucked against a hillside as if it were trying to disappear into the earth. From a distance it looked almost primitive, rougher than its neighbors, less imposing. No fancy woodpile visible from the trail. No stacked cords towering against the outer wall. Neighbors had assumed he was underprepared. Some had quietly expected him to come knocking, hat in hand, asking for extra wood before January arrived. He never knocked. And when February came, the cruelest month that year, with 3 consecutive blizzards dropping more than 4 feet of snow on the ridge, his fire burned clean and steady every single night. His logs split dry. His cabin held heat for 6 to 8 hours after the last log was placed, and the wood that fueled all of it had been stored underground, sealed away from frost and moisture, protected by nothing more than 2 feet of packed earth and one man's willingness to dig where everyone else refused to look. What did Elias Crow understand about earth, temperature, and preservation that the rest of Copper Creek Road had not even thought to ask? To understand what Elias Crow built, you first have to understand what the Bitterroot winters were actually doing to firewood, and why most of the men on that ridge had no idea. The Bitterroot Valley in the early 1880s was one of the last frontiers of serious homesteading in the American Northwest. Settlers had been pushing into the region since the late 1860s, following the valley's carved by the Clark Fork and its tributaries, claiming land under the Homestead Act of 1862 and building as fast as Montana's short construction seasons would allow. By 1883, Copper Creek Road had roughly 14 working homesteads, most of them between 2 and 7 years old. The men who built those cabins were not foolish. They were experienced, practical, and tough, but they had brought their wood storage habits with them from places that were cold, not places that were wet cold. That distinction mattered enormously. Montana winters at elevation are not simply cold. They are cyclically freezing and thawing, a rhythm that is far more destructive to stacked firewood than pure, consistent cold would be. A temperature of minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, held steady for weeks, actually preserves wood reasonably well. The moisture inside the fibers freezes and stays frozen. But the Bitterroot Range delivers something crueler. Nights dropping to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 23 degrees Celsius, followed by midday thaws climbing to 28 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius to minus 1 degree Celsius, followed by a new freeze after sundown. This cycle, repeated a dozen or more times across a single month, forces moisture deeper into the wood grain each time it thaws, then locks it in when it refreezes. Wood stored above ground, even under a decent lean-to roof, was exposed to this punishment relentlessly. Oral accounts recorded by the Ravalli County Historical Society describe settlers arriving at their woodpiles on January mornings to find the outer cords encased in ice, the inner logs damp and heavy, the splits no longer clean. A standard cord of mixed pine and fir, roughly 128 cubic feet, might yield 2/3 of its expected heat value when burned wet. That shortfall, compounded over 3 months of winter, was not merely inconvenient. It was dangerous. More firewood had to be cut to compensate. More time was spent outdoors. More exposure. More risk. Most settlers on the ridge stored there with a conventional way, stacked in open-air ricks against the south-facing cabin wall, sometimes sheltered by a crude shed roof, occasionally covered with animal hides or canvas. It was the method they knew. It was the method their fathers had used, and on most winters it was adequate. The winter of 1883 was not most winters. When the freeze-thaw cycles began in early November and continued without interruption for 11 straight weeks, the above-ground wood piles deteriorated faster than anyone had anticipated. By late January, at least 6 of the 14 homesteads on Copper Creek Road were rationing fuel. 2 families had begun burning fence posts. One family reportedly dismantled an interior partition wall to keep their stove alive through February. Elias Crow's stove burned steady and clean through all of it. Before Elias Crow ever picked up a shovel, before he drew his first rough sketch in the dirt outside his cabin door, there was a winter, not 1883, but 1881, that changed the way he thought about wood. He had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley in the spring of 1879, 2 years after his older brother had staked a claim along Copper Creek. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, not given to much talk. He had worked in the mines near Butte for 2 seasons before deciding that a man who owned land was in a fundamentally different position than a man who sold his hours underground. He built his first cabin in the summer of 1879, a single-room structure, 16 feet by 18 feet, green pine logs, a stone and clay hearth on the north wall, a split-shake roof, standard construction for the time, reasonable for the climate, or so he believed. The winter of 1880 to 1881 introduced him to the specific cruelty of Bitterroot cold. His woodpile, stacked in the customary way against the south wall, was fully exposed to the freeze-thaw cycle described by so many settlers of that era. By December, the outer layer of the rick had frozen solid into a kind of informal wall of ice-lock timber. By January, the logs he was pulling from inside the stack were heavy with absorbed moisture, 25 to 30% moisture content, by rough estimates that any experienced woodsman could feel in the weight of the log alone. A dry hardwood log at 20% moisture or below ignites cleanly and burns hot. A log above 25% fights the flame, hisses, produces white smoke, and delivers significantly less usable heat. Often 30 to 40% less energy per cord than properly seasoned would burn dry. The practical result was simple and punishing. Elias was burning more wood to get less heat, and working twice as hard to maintain a fire that remained, on its best days, mediocre. He began keeping rough notes in the back of a supply ledger that winter. Not precise scientific measurements. Elias Crow was not a trained engineer, but the kind of practical observations that a careful man makes when survival depends on understanding a pattern. He noted that the logs he pulled from the center of the stack, protected somewhat by the outer layers, burned noticeably better than the ones on the edges. He noted that the ground beneath the stack, where logs touched the frozen earth directly, produced the dampest wood of all. He noted that the earthen floor inside his root cellar, dug only 3 feet into the hillside for food storage, remained unfrozen through even the coldest nights. He pressed his hand against the dirt wall of that cellar in January and felt something that stopped him entirely. It was not warm. It was not even close to warm by human standards. But it was not frozen, either. The soil temperature at 3 feet below the surface, even with minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, air outside, held somewhere in a range of 35 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius. The earth was acting as a thermal buffer, absorbing cold slowly, releasing heat slowly, maintaining a narrow but consistent band of temperature regardless of what the air above it was doing. Elias pressed his hand against that wall for a long moment. Then he went back inside and stared at his dwindling woodpile, and he began to think. The idea did not come all at once. It rarely does with men like Elias Crow. It came the way a good fire comes, slowly, from a small point of heat, growing steadier as it found more fuel. The cellar already existed. That was the part that his neighbors would later struggle to understand. The part that made the whole thing seem almost too obvious in hindsight, and almost too strange in the moment it was first proposed. Every homesteader on Copper Creek Road had some version of a root cellar. It was a basic requirement of frontier life, not an innovation. You dug into the hillside or excavated beneath the floorboards, lined the walls with stone or packed clay, built a heavy door to keep animals out, and used the space to store potatoes, carrots, turnips, canned goods, salt pork, any other provisions that needed to stay cold but not frozen through the winter. The thermal principle at work was the same one Elias had felt with his hand against that earthen wall. The ground below the frost line maintained a temperature that oscillated very little, roughly between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius and 7 degrees Celsius, depending on depth, soil composition, and local groundwater conditions. Every settler on the ridge understood this in a practical sense. They used it every day for food. Not one of them had thought to use it for wood. Elias spent the spring and summer of 1882 thinking through the problem with the methodical patience of a man who has been cold enough to take the matter seriously. The core insight was straightforward once he articulated it to himself. The enemy of firewood in a bitterroot winter was not cold. Cold alone, as he had observed, did not ruin wood. The enemy was a transition, the repeated cycling between freeze and thaw that forced moisture into grain and stripped the wood of its burn quality. If he could store the wood in an environment that did not cycle, an environment that held a steady, stable temperature below the frost line, the wood would remain exactly as dry as the day it was split. Below the frost line in that part of Montana, true thermal stability began at roughly 36 to 42 inches of depth. Elias had already excavated the root cellar to approximately 36 inches. He needed to go deeper, and he needed to extend the space significantly to hold a meaningful quantity of wood. A standard winter supply for a single-room cabin required between 3 and 4 cords of split wood. One cord measured 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet in stack volume. He was planning to store 2 full cords underground as a strategic reserve, his insurance against exactly the kind of catastrophic wetwood failure he had suffered in 1881. The mathematics of the excavation were significant. 2 cords of split wood, stacked carefully, occupied roughly 256 cubic feet of space. Adding the access passage, the drainage consideration, and the ventilation gap he was already designing, the total underground footprint he was planning came to approximately 14 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 5 feet deep at its lowest point, in raw volume. He was talking about moving somewhere between 400 and 450 cubic feet of Montana clay and rock by hand, using a pick, a long-handled spade, and a wooden sledge to haul material out. His neighbors, when they heard what he was planning, had a number of opinions. Most of them were unfavorable. The digging began in late July of 1882, after the last of the summer haying was done, and before the first hints of autumn cold arrived to harden the ground. Elias Crow started not beneath the cabin floor, as his neighbors had assumed, but from the hillside itself, entering from the exterior slope behind the structure, angling downward at roughly 15 degrees until he reached the depth he needed, then leveling off into the main storage chamber. This approach was deliberate. Digging straight down to the cabin floor would have meant disrupting the existing structure, risking the foundation stones, and creating a vertical access shaft that was impractical for loading and unloading heavy split wood in the dark of a January morning. A sloped entry passage, what old-timers in some parts of the region call a decline entry, borrowed loosely from the same logic used in hillside mine adits, allowed him to walk wood in and out on a slight downward angle using a simple 2-wheel barrow. The physics were in his favor. A loaded barrow going down the ramp required control, not strength. An empty barrow coming back up was light enough to pull by hand. The passage itself was modest, roughly 28 inches wide and 52 inches tall at the entrance, narrowing slightly as it descended. Not comfortable for a tall man, but functional. Elias was 5 feet 10 inches and had learned in the Butte mines that a passage did not need to be pleasant to be useful. It needed to be structurally sound, properly drained, and wide enough for the work being done inside it. He reinforced the passage walls with flat stone slabs, dry stacked without mortar, set tightly enough to prevent soil collapse, but with small gaps that allowed any seeping groundwater to drain toward a shallow pit he dug at the lowest point of the chamber, a sump, in practical terms, roughly 18 inches square and 14 inches deep, lined with loose gravel to allow water to percolate away rather than pool on the floor. The main chamber took most of August to excavate. The Montana clay was dense and root-laced in the upper layers, easier but wetter deeper down. By the time he reached his target depth of 48 inches below the original ground surface, chosen specifically to sit 6 to 10 inches below the average local frost line, he had moved an estimated 420 cubic feet of material. The spoil, as miners called the excavated earth, was used to berm the exterior walls of the cabin on the north and west sides, adding a natural insulation layer of packed earth against the two faces of the structure most exposed to winter wind. That decision would prove significant later, though Elias did not yet know how significant. The chamber floor he packed hard and flat, then laid a single course of flat sandstone slabs, locally gathered, roughly 2 to 3 inches thick, across the entire surface. The stone served two purposes. It kept the split off the bare earth, preventing direct moisture wicking from the ground, and provided a stable, easy-to-clean surface for loading and stacking. Along the walls, he built simple wood stave racks, elevated 4 inches off the stone floor on short cedar blocks, designed to hold stacked splits with air gaps between the rows, critical for allowing whatever residual moisture remained in the wood to continue evaporating slowly in the stable underground air. The door at the passage entrance was the last piece. He built it heavy, 2 layers of split pine planks, the inner layer running horizontal, the outer layer running vertical, pegged together with wooden dowels. The air gap between the 2 layers, approximately 1 inch, acted as a modest thermal break, slowing the transfer of outside cold into the passage. He hung it on hand-forged iron strap hinges and fitted it with a simple wooden latch that could be operated with one hand, even while carrying an armload of wood. Total cost of materials beyond his own labor, roughly $4.60 by the estimate recorded in the supply ledger. Iron hardware, cedar blocks, sandstone gathered from a creek exposure half a mile east. By the 1st of September 1882, the underground with shelter was complete. Elias spent the next 6 weeks splitting and hauling 2 full cords of dry pine and fir, cut the previous spring, and seasoned through the summer, down the passage ramp and into the stacked racks below. The wood went in dry. The chamber temperature, measured by pressing a glass tube thermometer against the back wall, read 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius on the day he sealed the door for the first time. Before we get to what that chamber looked like in February, and what the temperature readings meant for the families along Copper Creek Road, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Every week we go deeper into the forgotten engineering of the American frontier, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Word travels fast in a community of 14 homesteads spread along 4 miles of road. By mid-August, most of Copper Creek Road knew that Elias Crow was digging a large hole behind his cabin. By the end of August, the more charitable interpretation that he was expanding his root cellar had given way to a more colorful set of theories. Harlan Voss, whose claim sat half a mile north of Elias's and who considered himself the most experienced builder on the ridge, was the first to ride down and take a formal look. He was 52 years old, had been homesteading in Montana since 1871, and had built 7 structures from raw timber in his adult life. He walked the length of the access passage, ducked into the chamber, stood upright, barely, and came back out with the expression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion. "You're putting firewood underground," he said. It was not a question. "That's right," said Elias. Voss was quiet for a moment. "Then, wood rots underground. Everyone knows that." It was a reasonable objection, and Elias had anticipated it. He explained the distinction between wood in contact with wet soil, which does indeed rot, through fungal decay driven by consistent moisture and moderate temperature, and was stored in a chambered, drained, ventilated space below the frost line, where the humidity was stable, the temperature was constant, and there was no freeze-thaw cycling to force moisture into the grain. The wood was not buried. It was sheltered. The difference was the same as the difference between a potato left in a mud puddle and a potato stored in a properly drained root cellar. One rots. The other keeps for months. Voss listened. Then he shook his head. Too much work for something that probably won't matter. Others were less measured. Raymond Pettit, a younger homesteader who had arrived in the valley in 1880 and whose opinion of himself exceeded his experience by a considerable margin, told 2 different neighbors that Elias had gone soft in the head from too much time alone. A third neighbor, whose name local oral accounts do not record with any consistency, referred to only as the Swede from the North Claim, reportedly laughed outright when the project was described to him and said that any man who spent August digging holes instead of putting up hay deserved whatever winter gave him. The technical criticisms were more substantive and worth examining honestly. Several neighbors raised a concern about ventilation. A sealed underground space, they argued, would develop stagnant, humid air over the course of the winter, and that humidity would condense on the cold surfaces and accomplish exactly the damage that above-ground moisture did to the outdoor rick. It was a real concern and not an unintelligent one. Condensation in enclosed underground spaces is a genuine phenomenon, driven by warm, moist air meeting a cold surface, the same principle that fogs a mirror in a warm bathroom. Elias's answer was structural. He had incorporated 2 ventilation points into the chamber design, a small intake opening near the floor of the passage entrance, covered with a fitted stone cap that could be adjusted to control airflow, and a narrow exhaust channel near the top of the back wall, rising at an angle to exit the hillside some 8 feet upslope. The system was passive, no moving parts, no mechanical assistance, and it worked on simple convective logic. Cooler, denser air entered low, and the slightly warmer air that had absorbed any residual moisture from the wood rose and escaped through the upper vent. The air exchange rate was slow by design, just enough to prevent stagnation without introducing enough outside air to destabilize the chamber temperature. It was the same basic principle used in traditional Norwegian timber storehouses and in the food cellars described by indigenous communities across the northern plains, though Elias, characteristically, did not invoke either comparison. He had arrived at the design by observation and reasoning, not by reference. His neighbors were not persuaded. Most of them returned to their own preparations, stacking wood against their cabin walls in a familiar way, trusting the methods that had worked well enough before. The Swede from the north claimed stacked an impressive 6 cords against his exterior wall, covered with a long pine slab lean-to, and was reported to have said that a man who relied on the ground to keep his wood dry was a man who did not understand wood. The ground, of course, understood exactly what it was doing. It had been doing it for a very long time. November 1882 arrived cold and stayed cold, and it did not behave itself. The first freeze-thaw cycle hit Copper Creek Road on the 8th of November, a hard freeze dropping to -9 degrees Fahrenheit, -23 degrees Celsius, overnight, followed by a midday thaw that pushed the air temperature up to 31 degrees Fahrenheit, -0.5 degrees Celsius, just barely below freezing but warm enough to begin releasing moisture from any snow that had accumulated on the wood piles. By the evening of the 9th, temperatures had plunged again, locking that released moisture back into the outer layers of every above-ground cord on the ridge. The cycle repeated night freeze, partial day thaw, refreeze, with only brief interruptions between November and late January. Local accounts preserved to the Ravalli County Historical Society describe it as one of the most persistently damaging winters for firewood that long-time settlers could recall, not because of a single catastrophic cold event, but because of the relentless alternation that stripped wood of its burn quality week by week. By the second week of December, Harlan Voss had noticed that his outer cords were burning poorly. He was an experienced enough man to recognize the signs. The initial reluctance to catch in the coals, the white smoke rolling from the firebox instead of the clean gray wisp of dry wood, the way the fire needed constant attention instead of settling into its own steady rhythm. He calculated that he was burning approximately 20 to 25% more wood than usual to maintain the same cabin temperature, a shortfall that, projected across the remaining 10 weeks of winter, put his total supply uncomfortably close to the margin. He began rationing in December. That was not something Harlan Voss had ever done before. Elias Crow, that same week, walked down his ramp, opened his underground chamber, and pulled a double armload of split pine. The wood was exactly as he had stacked it in September. Dry to the touch, light in the hand, the grain clean and tight with no surface frost, no rime, no absorbed moisture. He pressed his palm against the split-faced the way a baker presses bread dough, the instinctive test any experienced woodsman uses to estimate moisture content. It gave nothing back. It was as dry as the day it was cut. The chamber temperature that December morning read 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3.3 degrees Celsius on his glass thermometer. Outside, it was -14 degrees Fahrenheit, -25.5 degrees Celsius. The differential was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wood inside had experienced none of the cycling that had been destroying every above-ground rick on the ridge for the past 6 weeks. When he brought those splits to the firebox and lit them, they caught cleanly within 3 minutes and burned hot and even, with a steady orange-gold flame and minimal smoke. A cord of properly dried pine burned this way delivers an estimated 15 to 17 million BTUs of usable heat. The same cord, burned at 28 to 30% moisture content, which is what most of his neighbors were burning by January, delivers closer to 10 to 12 million BTUs. The difference per core was roughly 5 million BTUs. Enough heat, in practical frontier terms, to keep a single-room cabin at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius for an additional 3 to 4 days. Across 2 full cords of reserve, Elias was effectively getting a heat output of nearly 3 cords from 2 without cutting a single additional log. The blizzard that arrived in late January settled the question for anyone still inclined to doubt. 3 storms in 8 days deposited 4 feet and 2 inches of snow on the ridge, collapsed a lean-to roof over the Swedes' woodpile, buried 2 other above-ground ricks completely under drift that took 3 days to excavate, and pushed Harlan Voss's already stressed supply to its limit. He burned fence rails for 4 days in February, while waiting for a break in the weather that would allow him to ride to the nearest trading post. Elias Crow's underground chamber was untouched by all of it. The access ramp filled with snow at the entrance, which he cleared with 20 minutes of shoveling. The door opened. The wood was there, dry and stacked and patient, exactly where he had left it. He pulled what he needed, sealed the door, and went back inside to a fire that, by every practical measure, was the cleanest burning, most heat-efficient fire on Copper Creek Road that winter. His cabin interior temperature, on the coldest recorded night of that February, measured by the same glass thermometer, hung on the interior wall 4 feet from the hearth, held at 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius, at 4 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours after the last log had been added. The cabin had no particular thermal mass advantage over its neighbors. The hearth was a standard stone construction, competent but not exceptional. The logs were the same species, the same average diameter. The single variable was the quality of the fuel, and the quality of the fuel came entirely from the underground shelter that everyone on the ridge had spent 3 months laughing about. Harlan Voss rode down to Elias's claim in the first week of March, after the worst of the winter had broken. He stood at the entrance to the underground passage for a long moment without speaking. Then he asked how deep the main chamber floor was. Elias told him, 48 inches below grade at the lowest point. Voss nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is recalculating something he thought he already understood. "How much did you go through?" he finally asked. "About 1.25 cords," said Elias, "for the whole winter." Voss had burned through 5.5 cords, and had still needed the fence rails. By the spring of 1883, 3 of the 14 homesteads on Copper Creek Road had begun excavating their own underground with chambers. By the fall of that same year, 5 more were under construction. Harlan Voss's version, built with the meticulous care of a man determined not to be wrong twice, extended 14 feet into the hillside behind his barn, incorporated the same passive ventilation logic Elias had used, and added a second drainage sump near the entry passage that Voss had designed himself after wet springs showed him where groundwater moved across his particular slope. He stacked 4 cords inside it before the first November freeze. He burned 2 cords and a fraction that winter. He did not ration once. Raymond Pettit, the young homesteader who had suggested that Elias had gone soft in the head, built his own underground chamber in the summer of 1884. Local oral accounts note, with a dry humor characteristic of frontier communities, that he did not mention having laughed at the idea 2 years earlier. He simply dug the hole, built the racks, and stacked the wood. The results were the same. They were always the same, because the physics did not change based on who was doing the digging. Within 4 years of Elias Crow's first excavation, underground with storage had become common enough on the eastern Bitterroot Slope that a correspondent writing for the Montana Post in 1887 described it as a standard feature of well-managed homesteads in the mountain valleys, without attribution, without acknowledgement of where the idea had originated, in the way that practical solutions are absorbed into common practice, and quickly lose the name of the person who first worked them out. Elias Crow sold his claim in 1891 and moved north toward the Flathead Valley, where his brother had taken up new land. He left behind the cabin, the hearth, the earthen berms he had piled against the north and west walls, and the underground with chamber, still structurally sound after 9 winters of use. The new owner, by all available accounts, used it without modification for at least a decade. It is not known what happened to it after that. The hillside has long since reclaimed whatever remained. What does not disappear as easily is the principle itself. The thermal behavior of the Earth below the frost line is not a secret. It is not a lost technology. It is physics, old, patient, consistent physics that does not require electricity or machinery or manufactured insulation. The ground absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, below 36 to 48 inches of depth, depending on latitude and soil composition. The temperature of the Earth holds within a narrow band year-round, cold enough to preserve, stable enough to prevent the cycling that destroys. Indigenous communities across the northern plains, the subarctic, had understood this for centuries, using earth-sheltered caches and semi-subterranean storage structures long before European settlers arrived with their above-ground woodpiles and their confidence in familiar methods. The Norse settlers of Iceland and Greenland had used turf-covered storehouses on the same principle for 1,000 years before the Bitterroot was settled. The principle shows up in traditional Japanese root storage, in the earthen food caches of the Dena'ina people of Alaska, in the stone-lined souterrains of Iron Age Scotland. What Elias Crow did was not an invention. It was a rediscovery, the kind of practical reconvergence that happens when a man is cold enough and honest enough to look at the ground beneath his feet and ask what it already knows. Modern homesteaders and off-grid builders who have begun experimenting with earth shelter with storage in recent years are finding what Elias found. Would store below the frost line at stable humidity and temperature, retains its moisture content within 2 to 5 percentage points of its original split condition across a full winter. It does not require power. It does not require manufactured vapor barriers or climate-controlled sheds. It requires a shovel, some flat stone, a door that seals decently, and the willingness to dig. The willingness to dig is where most people stop. Elias Crow did not stop there. He dug down to where the earth was already doing the work. Steady, silent, indifferent to blizzards and freeze-thaw cycles and the opinions of neighbors. He stacked his wood inside that steadiness. And when the worst winter in a decade came rolling down off the Bitterroot Range with everything it had, his fire burned clean, and his wood stayed dry, and the only question anyone on Copper Creek Road was asking by March was the one Harlan Voss had asked, standing at the entrance to the passage with his hat in his hands. How deep did you go? The answer, as it turns out, was not very deep at all. Just deep enough. If this story of forgotten frontier engineering made you think differently about what the ground beneath your feet already knows, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what technique from the old frontier you want us to uncover next. There are dozens more stories like this one, solutions that worked, were forgotten, and are waiting to be dug up again. We'll see you in the next one. Educational disclaimer. This video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.